Welcome to Libeth. The Tokugawa shogunate did not present itself as a military government that had seized power and held it by force, even though that is precisely what it was. It presented itself as the legitimate administrative expression of an imperial will that had delegated governance to the shogun's house, a delegation that had been in place for over 2 centuries and had therefore acquired the status of natural order. Authority in Tokugawa Japan was legitimized by layering. The emperor sat at the apex, divine and essentially powerless, and the shogun governed in his name, which meant that every act of government carried the theoretical sanction of the throne, while the actual machinery of power resided entirely in the military bureaucracy based in Edo. The elegance of this arrangement was that it made the existing order appear cosmologically grounded. You were not obeying a warlord dynasty. You were obeying the correctly organized expression of heaven's will on earth. And that appearance of cosmological grounding was precisely what made the system so vulnerable the moment anyone found a way to separate the appearance from the reality. The separation, when it came, was not a sudden rupture. It was a slow, structural exposure, driven by pressures that had been accumulating for decades before Mitford arrived in 1866. The first and most fundamental pressure was economic. The Tokugawa system had organized its stability around a rice economy, with the samurai class receiving stipends paid in rice, and the domains exercising fiscal authority within their own territories according to a logic that kept commerce subordinate and controlled. This arrangement worked as long as the economy remained closed, and as long as the rice-to-commodity exchange rate stayed predictable. When Commodore Perry forced open the treaty ports in 1853 and 1854, and Western goods began flowing into Japan at prices set by international markets rather than domestic policy, the rice economy began to destabilize in ways the Bakufu had no institutional tools to manage. Rice prices became volatile. The purchasing power of samurai stipends eroded. The merchant class, nominally the lowest of the 4 formal social classes, began accumulating economic power at a rate that inverted the theoretical social hierarchy without formally challenging it. The gap between how the system said it worked and how it actually worked grew wider with every passing year, and that gap was the breeding ground of political crisis. The domain system was where this structural mismatch between formal authority and actual control became most dangerous. The Bakufu governed Japan through a network of over 250 semi-autonomous domains, each ruled by a daimyo who owed formal allegiance to the shogun, but administered his own territory, maintained his own samurai retainers, and exercised genuine local power. This arrangement had been designed to create a balance of controlled decentralization. Domains were strong enough to administer themselves efficiently, but, in theory, not strong enough to challenge the center. The theory held as long as the center remained stronger than any individual domain or any coalition of domains. It failed the moment Western military technology demonstrated in the treaty negotiations of the 1850s that the Bakufu could not actually perform the core function of sovereignty, which is the defense of the national territory. A government that cannot protect its borders has lost the most basic claim to legitimate authority, and every domain lord in Japan understood this even when none of them said it aloud. The domains that drew the most consequential lessons from the Bakufu's humiliation were those with the longest grievances and the most economic and military resources to act on them. The great domains of the Southwest, Satsuma and Choshu in particular, had never fully accepted Tokugawa supremacy as anything other than a balance of power that happened to favor Edo. And when the balance of power began to shift, they moved quickly. Their movement was ideological on the surface. The slogan that galvanized opposition to the shogunate translated roughly as "Revere the Emperor, expel the barbarians," which framed the political crisis as a religious and nationalist cause rather than a factional struggle for control. But the ideology was the weapon, not the motivation. What the anti-shogunate coalition wanted was to replace one governing structure with another, to move from a system in which the Tokugawa family held administrative supremacy to a system in which a new set of actors, centered on the imperial court and staffed largely by ambitious men from the southwestern domains, would hold that supremacy instead. The emperor was the legitimizing symbol for this transformation, just as he had always been the legitimizing symbol for the Tokugawa arrangement, which meant that the restoration of imperial rule was not a revolution in the deepest sense, but a rotation of the faction holding power at the center of an unchanged structure of legitimization. Mitford arrived in the middle of this rotation. His posting to the British legation placed him inside one of the most consequential 4-year periods in Japanese history, the final years of the shogunate, the civil war known as the Boshin War between 1868 and 1869, and the first year of the Meiji government. He was not a passive observer. The British legation was itself a political actor, representing a power that both the pro-shogunate and anti-shogunate factions needed to court, since British military and commercial support could tip the balance in ways that no domestic realignment could. Mitford moved through this environment with the particular combination of access and limitation that defines the diplomat's position. He could speak to powerful people on all sides, but his understanding was always mediated by the interests he represented and by the categories his own culture gave him for interpreting what he saw. What he saw included assassinations. His colleagues were killed. He was present at moments of direct political violence. The Japan he wrote about was not a museum exhibit of a vanished civilization. It was a place in active, armed transformation, and some of that transformation was directed at people like him. The anti-foreign violence that Mitford experienced personally was not irrational. It was the logical consequence of a specific structural arrangement that the Western powers had imposed on Japan through the unequal treaties of the 1850s. These treaties granted Western merchants and diplomats extraterritorial rights, meaning they lived in Japan under their own legal systems, immune to Japanese law, and fixed tariff rates at levels favorable to Western commercial interests, which prevented Japan from protecting its domestic economy through trade policy in the way that developing economies typically need to do. The foreign settlements in the treaty ports, places like Yokohama, where Mitford was based, were not simply communities of outsiders living alongside Japanese society. They were enclaves of extraterritorial privilege operating at the center of a Japanese economy that was being systematically disadvantaged by their presence. Japanese resentment of this arrangement was entirely rational, and the violence it generated was targeted and specific. It was not hostility to the foreign as such, but hostility to the particular form of foreign presence that the treaties had made possible. Mitford lived inside this arrangement and benefited from it, which is a fact his book never directly examines. He had access to Japanese political life that most Westerners could not obtain, and he used that access to produce a text that would shape Western understanding of Japan for decades. But the access itself was structured by treaty rights that were experienced by many Japanese as a form of coercion. And that coercion was part of the political pressure pushing Japan toward the transformation Mitford was witnessing. He was, in a precise sense, both observer and participant in the forces producing the crisis he described. The social structure that Mitford encountered was one in which the formal categories of organization, the four-class system of samurai, farmer, artisan, and merchant, were already detached from the economic realities they were supposed to describe. The samurai class was legally dominant but financially precarious, because their stipends were paid in a rice whose value was declining relative to the goods that urban life required. The merchant class was formally subordinate but economically powerful, because trade and credit had become the actual engines of the economy, regardless of what the legal hierarchy said. This inversion of formal status and actual power was not a minor anomaly. It was a structural contradiction at the heart of the Tokugawa order, and it meant that the people who were supposed to embody the ethical core of the civilization, the samurai with their codes of loyalty and honor and discipline, were the people most acutely experiencing the material consequences of the system's failure. The tales that Mitford collected were largely tales produced by and for this class, a class that was in the process of being dissolved, that knew it was being dissolved, and that was producing stories about itself as a way of asserting that what it represented had value that could not simply be bureaucratically abolished. The family structure that organized the samurai world was not the nuclear family of Western bourgeois life. It was the ai, the household understood as a corporate entity that extended through time, incorporating the dead, the living, and the not yet born into a single ongoing institution with obligations that no individual member could simply choose to abandon. Loyalty to the household was the foundational ethical obligation from which all other loyalties derived. The son owed a duty to the father that persisted beyond the father's death. The retainer owed a duty to the lord that persisted beyond the lord's death. The living were accountable to the dead in a way that made the past a continuously active moral presence, rather than simply a record of what had happened before. This is the framework within which the vendetta makes sense, not as a primitive survival of pre-legal violence, but as a sophisticated system for enforcing obligations across time, for ensuring that dishonor done to the dead was answered by the living in a way that restored the integrity of the household's moral continuity. The legal apparatus that Mitford describes in his essay on vendetta, the formal registration of a grievance with the government, the procedural rules governing pursuit and killing, shows that this was not extralegal violence, but a form of state-sanctioned private enforcement of family obligation, built into the architecture of the Tokugawa legal system, because the Tokugawa system understood that household honor was one of the primary mechanisms of social cohesion. The domain was the household scaled up. The loyalty that the son owed to the father, the retainer owed to the daimyo, and this scaling was not metaphorical but structural. The political vocabulary of the Tokugawa period was a vocabulary of familial obligation extended outward through concentric circles of loyalty until it encompassed the entire social order. This meant that when the domain system began to collapse, when the bakufu's inability to perform its central functions became undeniable, the collapse did not register only as a political event. It registered as a moral catastrophe, because the political and the moral were not separable in a system where authority was legitimized by exactly the kind of layered household obligation that Mitford's tales illustrate. The 47 Ronin story, the tale Mitford places first and longest in his collection, is not merely an exciting narrative about loyalty and revenge. It is a worked example of what happens when the formal structure of obligation continues to make demands after the institutional context that gave those demands their meaning has been destroyed. The Lord is dead. The obligation persists. The retainers cannot be released from what they owe because the household extends through time, and the dead lord is still their lord. They spend years in patient performance of dissolution, drinking, carousing, appearing to have abandoned their duty, precisely because the system of surveillance and institutional control that the shogunate maintains would destroy them if it understood what they were actually doing. The patience, the disguise, the willingness to sacrifice personal reputation and family happiness in service of an obligation to the dead. This is not an exceptional story about exceptional men. It is a demonstration of what the system demanded of anyone who took it seriously. By the time Mitford was collecting and writing, the world that produced these stories was being formally dismantled. The Meiji government that emerged from the Civil War was a government of people who had grown up inside the samurai culture and its obligations, but who had made the analytical judgment that Japan's survival in the world of Western industrial power required replacing that culture with something else. A centralized state with a national army, a Western-style legal system, a publicly educated citizenry, and a class of technical administrators rather than hereditary warriors. The samurai class was abolished formally in the years after 1868. The domain system was dissolved. The vendetta, which Mitford's essay treats as a functioning legal institution, was made illegal by 1873. The world the book describes was already historical when the book appeared, and everyone involved, Mitford, the Japanese informants and translators who helped him, the Meiji officials who were abolishing the institutions Mitford was documenting, knew it. What this means for reading the book is that the fragmentation it describes is not a catastrophe that arrives at the end of the story. It is the condition from which the story is told. The Tokugawa system had no center capable of holding its contradictions together. The formal authority it claimed depended on a military supremacy it could no longer perform. The social hierarchy it enforced was being inverted by economic forces it could not control. The household loyalties it relied upon for social cohesion were producing exactly the kind of autonomous obligation that made political centralization impossible. The fall of the shogunate was not a surprise. It was the outcome of a system that had been generating its own instability for decades. And what Mitford was watching in 1866 and 1867 and 1868 was not the beginning of a collapse, but the final visible stages of one that had been underway for a generation. The tales he collected are the cultural products of a class that understood, at some level, that it was living at the end of something, and that the way to respond to the end of something is to say, as clearly and as completely as possible, what it was. That's all for today on Libeth. One new book every week. At least we try.